Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch, the show that you all know keeps a watch on President Trump, especially in the context of the measures that he is taking that destroy our freedom and our well-being here in America. I want to focus in on President Trump's renewed focus on the drug war. This government program of the federal government that has been going on for decades, well, really all of our lives. It's an ongoing, never-ending, perpetual government program. And I want to focus on that to show you how President Trump and the U.S. national security establishment is using the drug war as a way to accelerate the destruction of freedom and the well-being of the American people. Let me begin by going back to the end of the Cold War. The Cold War was probably the biggest racket in American history. The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. There was even a movie, the Russians are coming. The whole idea of the Cold War was to inculcate this fear among the American people that the communists were coming to take over America. And it was based on propaganda, indoctrination, and it was spectacularly successful. Very few Americans did not live their lives in fear of the Reds. The Reds were everywhere, they told us. They were in Hollywood, and they went after people in Hollywood, and they went after people who had been members of the Communist Party in what is purportedly a free society. A free society is where you have the right to join whatever you want to join. You believe in whatever philosophy you want to believe in, but not during the Cold War. It was us against them because they were coming to get us. The Reds were coming to get us. Look at the obsession with Cuba, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. Over 100,000 American soldiers sacrificed for nothing because they said, if we don't intervene, the dominoes will fall and the Reds will be on American shores before we know it. So it was one great big racket. In fact, one big exception of this was President Kennedy. He, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he saw that this is a big racket. He said he's going to bring it to an end. He's going to move America in a totally different direction from that of the national security establishment, i.e. the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. He announced that at his peace speech at American University in June of '63. 5 months later, they dealt with him there in the streets of Dallas. And then the trajectory continued on for the Cold War. In 1989, it suddenly comes to an end, unexpectedly. It shocked everybody because everybody assumed that the Cold War would go on forever. Now, the big thing about the Cold War was that it was a way to justify the conversion of the federal government from what had been a limited government republic. That was our founding governmental system, a limited government republic. And it got converted to a national security state after World War II. And the rationale behind this conversion was to protect us from the communist threat. Now, a national security state is totally different from a limited government republic. A national security state has omnipotent powers. There is no such thing as limited government when you have omnipotent government. The national security state acquired the powers of state-sponsored assassinations, for example. That power didn't exist with a limited government republic. It was expressly prohibited, in fact, by the Fifth Amendment, that the federal government could not take people's lives without due process of law. And yet an assassination does precisely that. And then when combined with the interventionist foreign policy, they started waging undeclared wars of aggression in violation of the Constitution. But the whole rationale behind this conversion was the communist threat, the so-called communist threat, the racket. And so when it comes to an end, the national security establishment naturally gets a little panicky here because now they've lost their rationale for the conversion. And in fact, people were screaming for a peace dividend. And by that, they meant a drastic reduction in the size and expenditures for the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, or the national security state. Now, Very few people were calling for a dismantling of the national security state and a restoration of the limited government republic. But clearly things were moving in that direction, where it would not have been abnormal for the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA to think, oh boy, once they get that peace dividend, there's drastic reductions, and they realize there's no real threat against America at all, that they're going to start thinking in terms of the next logical step, and that is restore the limited government republic, because the rationale for the national security state, the Cold War racket, was no longer there. So they were panicking. And one of the fascinating things that they said in the national security establishment is, okay, we realize that the Cold War is over, but you still need us because we can help fight the war on drugs. Okay? Now, this is 1989. The war on drugs had been waged all of our lives. Many of you know I grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border, and I saw the drug war when I was a kid. I mean, my dad was a U.S. magistrate in Laredo for a time, and Timothy Leary, the famous LSD guru, he was arrested there in Laredo, brought before my dad for a preliminary hearing. And my dad, had a whole stream of drug war suspects coming through his office, setting bond and so forth. This is back in the 1960s. And it occurred even before that. I think, if you go back to Billie Holiday, they were targeting her because she was a drug addict. They were targeting her. Imagine that, targeting a drug addict, going after her, trying to get her in jail, incarcerated, and so forth. Punish her for ingesting drugs as part of her drug addiction. I mean, how pathetic is that? So the thing's been going on, and so the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA say, well, we can participate in this. We've lost our Cold War official enemy, but we can participate in this. And so the irony is that that's what they're doing now. They've got this whole flotilla of ships over there, warships, nuclear submarines, jet planes in the Caribbean offshore from Venezuela, saying, we're going to fight the war on drugs. And they just shot a boat. It was absolutely incredible. A boat coming out of Venezuela with 11 people on it that they say had drugs in it. They just blew it out of the water. Now the custom of this, one has to, of course, ask, what jurisdiction does the U.S. government have enforcing the drug war in international waters? I can understand the rationale of enforcing the drug war in U.S. waters, okay? I don't agree with it, of course, but I can understand the rationale. But international waters, why aren't people free to carry drugs in international waters? But the U.S. officials say, no, our drug war, our drug laws extend, I guess, all over the world. I'm not sure whether they can. Well, I guess they can, because they arrest people in Mexico for violating U.S. drug laws, and they get them extradited over here and convicted for violating U.S. drug laws while they're in Mexico. But anyway, they use these warships and planes and stuff. It's not real clear how they blew this thing out of the water, but they killed everybody. And customarily before this, the Coast Guard, which would enforce the drug war, they would approach a boat and order it to stop. The boat would stop. They would say, we're going to board the boat to search it. Again, I don't know how they do this without a search warrant, but they do. And then they find the drugs, and then they arrest the person and bring him back to the United States to stand trial, where he's prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated. And the whole process just keeps going on and on and on. There's no end to the drug war. It goes on and on and on. Well, let me digress for a minute and say something about that it's so amazing to me to see federal judges today and federal prosecutors saying the same things and doing the same things that they were doing back in the 1960s. And then in the 70s too, because I went back to Laredo to practice law, and I handled drug cases. I was a trial attorney, both civil and criminal. So was my dad. We were partners. We were partners together. And the judges at that time were exclaiming against the war on drugs and drug defendants would come before them and a lot of them would give maximum jail sentences. There was a federal judge in San Antonio called Maximum John. He had gone to high school with my dad. My dad knew him, but no matter what drug case came before Maximum John, it was automatically the maximum because he was going to do his part to win the war on drugs. And the same with the prosecutors board and the DEA agents. I knew some of the DEA agents. They were all dedicated, and boy, they guys in their early 30s or so. They were going to win the war on drugs. And what's so fascinating is that those people are either all dead or retired at this point. And now you've got this new generation of federal judges doing the same thing. And I'm thinking, do they realize they're just rehashing the same thing that has been rehashed for decades, all of our lives? Oh, I'm going to get my maximum jail sentence. We're going to we pounded them in the war on drugs in this case, boy. And then you see the press releases from the Justice Department. We've made major strides in the drug war here. No, they haven't. Because they're just repeating the same lines that were made 50 years ago. It just goes on and on and on and on. And so for President Trump and the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to think that like blowing this boat out of the water on a suspicion that it was carrying drugs, killing the 11 occupants, is just murder. It's legalized murder because the drug war offenses are a criminal offense. It's not an act of war. We're not at war with anybody. We're not at war with Venezuela. Now, they call it a drug war. They say, oh, we're at war with the drug cartels in Venezuela and Mexico or Colombia or whatever. But that's just a figure of speech. And drug laws are a criminal offense. That's why the federal courts are clogged with drug cases. And let me digress a minute also on these federal judges because, they really are, they can make their own choices in life as to what they want to do with their lives. But in my book, they are living meaningless lives. My hunch is that these federal judges the federal prosecutors is more turnover, but with federal judges, it's a lifetime appointment. Most of them keep that lifetime appointment. They like the power. They like the prestige. They know that they cannot be removed from office. But they end up living meaningless lives, a life without meaning. Imagine you're given one life to live, and you get to the end of that life, you're on your deathbed, and you think, what did I do with my life? My life had no meaning. And that's the only thing that these federal judges can be thinking if they're being objective about their lives, if they're really doing self-analysis and introspective reflection on how they live their lives. Now, I'm referring to the judges whose dockets are predominantly drug cases or immigration cases, which characterizes federal judges in the Southwest. We had a lawyer in Laredo who was the most brilliant guy you'd ever meet. Just brilliant. He graduated from the University of Texas Law School, top of his class. He was editor of the Law Review. Comes back to Laredo. He could have gotten a job with any top firm in Texas or anywhere. He was that brilliant. But he comes back to Laredo. His family was a long-time family in Laredo, been there for generations. His uncle served as a congressman. Another one was a prosecutor. Another one was a state district judge. So he came back to Laredo and joined a very prestigious law firm in Laredo. Brilliant guy. You didn't want to go up against him in court because the guy was one heck of a smart lawyer. And at one point he gets nominated to be a federal judge, and he accepts it. I assume he even sought it out, but he gets appointed to be federal judge, and so he spends the rest of his life, I don't know, maybe he was 45 or something, spent the rest of his life doing, I presume, I didn't keep track of it, but presume mostly immigration and drug cases. It's right there on the border. And all I kept thinking as years went by, I said, he wasted his life. He just wasted his life because he's got this brilliant legal mind, and he's spending it on drug cases and immigration cases and accomplishing nothing. Okay, so you send the guy to jail. What difference does it make? You send the next guy to jail. What difference does it make? Oh, you order the deportation of this guy. Okay, so what? Oh, transporting illegal immigrants. Oh, send him away. What difference does it make? These government programs have no meaning. They just go on and on and on. They just keep repeating. And I just often wondered when he came to his deathbed, he passed away, is whether he looked back on his life and said, man, I ended up living a life without meaning. And I think that applies to most of these federal judges. They live meaningless lives. And to a certain extent, also the DEA officials that stay there through their whole lives. The immigration officials, Border Patrol, meaningless lives. But in any event, so you've got Trump over there thinking that he's going to win the war on drugs. That he's going to battle out that drug cartel, Trinidad, Agua, or whatever, in Venezuela, which is a gang that nobody had ever heard of before, 3 or 4 years ago or so. All of a sudden now it's, oh my gosh, Jacob, this gang's coming to get me and all this. So it's sort of adding to the official enemies that always characterize a national security state. I think there's also the possibility, I've written this before even they sent warships to Venezuela. I wrote in my blog at fff.org, I said, with the Epstein scandal, I mean, this is the first time there's been rebellion among the MAGA people within the Trump administration. They've all gone along with everything he's wanted, all his police state that he's now expanding on his immigration system, and the police state that we've always had on the drug war. He's expanding them outside the borderlands area. But the MAGA people love it. They don't care if freedom's destroyed. I mean, they're going to support President Trump, except when it came to Epstein. And when Trump refused to order the release of all the Epstein files, there was rebellion afoot, and there still is. And I wrote in my blog post, don't be surprised if he starts a foreign war. Because as James Madison said, that one of the time-honored tricks of the Roman emperors was that whenever there was a rebellion afoot in the empire, like out of a rebellion over out-of-control federal spending to fight all the imperial wars that the Roman Empire was fighting, and the welfare state and so forth. Same thing as here in the United States, the out-of-control federal spending and debt. The emperor would just start a foreign war. And that would get everybody all riled up, stand up, Pledge of Allegiance, Star-Spangled Banner, rally to the flag, support the troops, thank the troops for their service, and everybody forgets the rebellion. And I said, don't be surprised if that happens. And sure enough, a few weeks later, Trump is sending all these troops, I think it's 4,000 right now, and all these warships to the Caribbean, which have grabbed attention. So I think that might be a factor here, in my opinion, of what's going on. But I think they're also looking for an excuse for regime change here, because it seems to me it's like a lot of firepower to blast a few boats out of the water. And let me tell you something. There was no drug lords in that boat. These are poor people. These are people that are the mules. They get paid, $1,000 or something to take these drugs. The drug lords are not going to be risking their lives on those boats. So they accomplish nothing except just killing those people. Now they send a message is, hey, if you're you better think of some other way to ship these drugs out. Well, that's precisely what they do. They just figure out other ways. When there's a huge demand, this is what I can't believe that Trump and the DEA and the federal judges, the prosecutors don't realize this, because it's so obvious that when you clamp down on the war on drugs, there's still a huge demand for drugs in the United States, which nobody wants to address. Okay, why are so many millions of Americans wanting mind-altering substances? Nobody wants to address that. But there's obviously a huge demand. And Trump says, well, the drug dealers are attacking America. No, they're not attacking America. They're giving Americans what they want. And the irony is that many of the people that are ingesting these drugs as 30 and 40-year-olds were the students in the public schools that their parents are forced to send them to, where they were subjected to those DARE lectures by the DARE cops. Dare to say no to drugs, And here they are now, as adults, ingesting the drugs that the DARE cops told them not to ingest. But I can't believe that all these government officials don't realize that when they clamped down in one area, the drug lords just moved to another area. That's what happened in Laredo in the late 70s. I mean, they came in with a police state like you wouldn't believe it. DEA flooded into Laredo. Okay, they were gonna, because it was a big hub for importation. I mean, the criminal defense lawyers, we were all doing really well. I mean, we were making a lot of money. Every criminal defense lawyer in Laredo was making a lot of money off all these drug cases. And they clamped down. They flooded the area with DEA agents. And so what happened? They just moved to Miami or Florida. They moved their operations, okay? And so finally the DEA figures that out, and so they moved to Florida, and they just moved somewhere else. I mean, the drug lords are always going to do what is necessary to get those drugs in, and now they may catch a certain amount, which they do, but that's just the cost of doing business. I mean, y'all have seen the movies, Narcos Mexico, where they kill a cartel here or there, and they're quickly replaced, because there's a lot of money to be made. Even when they bust a drug gang or make a big drug bust, it's a tiny percentage. Why don't they realize this? Well, I think they do. But they use the drug war, U.S. officials use the drug war as a way to expand power. And make money too. I mean, look, there's a huge drug war bureaucracy. Federal judges have very nice salaries. Federal prosecutors have very nice salaries. DEA agents, a lot of them have mortgages. They're putting kids through school. They know that this racket is sustaining them. All the clerks, the secretaries. It's a drug war bureaucracy. And I think that's partly what's going on here. It's money and it's power. That they have the power to punish people for ingesting something. Now, you couldn't find a better violation of the principles of liberty than a drug law. I mean, in a genuinely free society, you got a right to ingest whatever you want to ingest. It's your business. Nobody's business what you're ingesting. I don't care how harmful or how dangerous it is. You want to drink alcohol till your liver goes into cirrhosis? That's your right. You know, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I think we'd all say that's a bad thing. Same with bad drugs, illicit drugs, and so forth. But that's what freedom's about. It's the right to choose wrongly as long as you're not initiating violence against another person. So the drug war really provides proof of our serfdom society. We are their serfs. We exist to serve them in the government, and they control us by being able to say, you go to your room in a penitentiary for 20 years because you ingested something that you're not supposed to ingest. So it's control and money. There's also the bribery aspect of this. And then there's also the CIA. I mean, you know, look at how much evidence has come out where the CIA is involved in drug running. It's very possible that many of these military operations are going to be oriented toward wiping out the competition. You know, nobody likes competition. And if the CIA is in fact engaged in drug dealing, it's in their interest to get rid of rival cartels. There's a great documentary. I think it's called I forget, the last documentary. I think it's about the Kiki Camarena case. Now, if you don't know anything about the Kiki Camarena case, I highly recommend watching Narcos Mexico. Now, so there's Narcos, which revolves a lot around Pablo Escobar, who they killed in the 80s. Saying, oh, well, this is going to solve everything. We get Pablo Escobar. I mean, he was the big bugaboo at that time. They killed him, and I think didn't affect anything. We're still doing the same thing we were doing back in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. Well, the Kiki Camarena case was involved a DEA agent who was captured, kidnapped, tortured, and executed after he discovered this huge, marijuana field in Mexico. DEA, yes, was operating inside Mexico. So they find this, Camarena finds this huge, I forget how many acres, but I think it was tens of thousands of acres. And they burned it all. So they kidnapped this guy and tortured him, which to me made no sense because they know what's going to be the result of the U.S. government for doing this to a DEA agent. Well, in this documentary called I think it's called The Last Documentary, but you can just Google Kiki Camarena, Rafael Caro Quintero. He was the guy supposedly in charge of the torture. He was recently extradited or sent to the United States by Mexican officials, but he was there involved in this torture and killing of Camarena. But this documentary says that there was a CIA agent in that room, in that torture room, and it's a very persuasive documentary. I mean, they've got witnesses there, including Mexican cops who were in the room saying, yes, the CIA was there, which would make sense. That the CIA was trying to figure out how much Camarena knew and how much he had reported to his officials. So it's a corrupt ballgame, but they have to know this. And so they keep it in existence as an excuse for power. So they say, Nicolas Maduro, the socialist dictator of Venezuela, who is clearly illegitimate, he clearly lost the election there, he's letting in these drugs into the United States. He's letting them. Look, the U.S. government can't control the distribution of drugs in the United States. How do they expect him to control the distribution of drugs in Venezuela or Mexico to control? But you see, they use that as the excuse. Oh, they're not controlling it. Or even worse, they're part of it. They're part of it. Well, how come the same reason doesn't apply here in the United States? So it gives them an excuse to engage in foreign interventionism, which I think they're looking toward. They're looking for a Gulf of Tonkin type of fake attack where they can say, we've been attacked. We have no choice but to defend ourselves and go in there and oust Maduro. And I think there'd be popular acclaim because everybody knows he's illegitimate, that he lost that last presidential election. He's using the national security establishment, because they're a national security state too, Venezuela, just like the U.S., to put down protesters, shoot protesters, incarcerate protesters. The guy's brutal. And he's mobilized the entire citizens to resist this invasion. If there is an invasion, they're not going to fight for Maduro. I am convinced they will all surrender, including the Venezuelan troops. I think they'll surrender very quickly. They're not going to oppose a regime, the most powerful military in history, especially when it establishes air superiority within 30 minutes. It can bomb at will all over the country. So Maduro, if the U.S. decides that they're going to use the drug war as the excuse, and they have a $50 million reward for getting Maduro, his goose is cooked. My feeling is they're going to keep putting pressure on him and try to pressure him into resigning and going to some other country and living out the rest of his life there, as compared to like what they did with the guy in Panama, Noriega, where they invaded there to get him and they ended up bringing him back to the United States in chains and put him in jail for, I don't know if it was the rest of his life, but it was pretty close. So it's a racket. It's just a great big racket that they use to expand their power. And you can see it along the border. You know, I've long pointed out that the borderlands are a police state. They're an immigration police state, but they're a drug war police state too. And so what Trump is doing by designating these drug gangs as terrorist organizations, he's conflating the war on drugs with the war on terrorism that he then says, oh, well, see, we can use the military because it's the war on terrorism. And so, and of course, the war on terrorism is a great big racket in and of itself. It was intended to replace the war on communism when the Cold War ended. And so after the 9/11 attacks, which had come about after they had killed multitudes of people in Iraq, including children, and the anger then generates itself in a retaliatory strike, and then it's like, oh, we're back to the races. And so today they've reignited Cold War II with Russia, with the NATO annex over with Ukraine and so forth, and then the trade wars against China and the sanctions and so forth. They've got the best of all worlds to sustain the national security establishment. They don't need to worry about even a peace dividend here. They got the war on communism, the war on terrorism, the war on drugs, the war on immigrants. Put all those together, and it's a recipe for disaster for the American people. Because as we can see, Trump is now expanding the police state across the country. This law and order business is in large part revolves around the war on drugs. Because with the war on drugs comes violence. Just like the war on alcohol. Prohibition brought violence with Al Capone. They have to know that. And they use that violence then as an excuse to say, oh, well, we need law and order. Well, the way to get law and order is just legalize drugs. Okay, that way you get rid of the violence. You get rid of the cartels immediately. We libertarians have said that for decades. That's the way you get rid of the violence. You're not going to get rid of the violence by shooting boats out of the Caribbean or by cracking down on the war on drugs. You're going to get more violence. But that's what they then use to say, well, we need to send troops into Washington, D.C. for law and order, and Chicago for law and order. So they bootstrap themselves. They favor the war on drugs, which brings the violence. They use the violence to say, well, now we need to expand the police state nationwide. And so you're seeing combined the law and order business with the war on immigrants business and the war on terrorism business is all combined to expand this militarized police state across America. And you combine that with their assaults on habeas corpus and due process of law, it's not difficult to see where this country's headed. It's heading in a very ominous, very dark, very bad direction. You're looking at a militarized police state society. That's not a very attractive society, and it certainly is not a free society. That's my report for Trump Watch this week. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you again for your great support of our efforts here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm Jacob Hornberger. Until next time.